When the word video game comes to mind, what's the first thing you think of? Some might think of classic games like Super Mario Bros. Or Mega Man. Some might also think of more modern games as well, like Call of Duty or The Witcher. Things that all these games have in common is the fact that they create an experience. Jesse Schell, author of The Art of Game Design, A Book of Lenses, says how without the experience, the game is worthless. One of, if not the most controversial games of this year has been Cyberpunk 2077. The initial teaser trailer being released back in 2013, the hype for the game was absolutely absurd. CD Projekt Red, known for making the critically acclaimed series The Witcher, had gigantic shoes to fill with this project. Around 8 years of development finally brought Cyberpunk 2077 to gamers after multiple release date pushbacks due to the game not being ready. And boy, was it a huge letdown for many. However, my job in this video isn't to do what everyone else has already done. I'm not going to destroy the designers of the game for releasing an unpolished video game. Instead, I'm going to fully analyze the design behind Cyberpunk 2077 using Jesse Schell's book as a reference to show how Cyberpunk 2077 is actually a good game. Before we begin, we're going to need to dive into the basics of what makes a video game a video game. Schell takes the concept of video games and breaks it down into four main elements. The elements are mechanics, story, aesthetics, and technology. The mechanics are what make the game function. They describe the goal of the game and how the players are able to manipulate the game to make it their own story. Adding on to that, the story is the sequence of events that unfold in your game. The story is the message and themes you want to convey to the player that captivate the player and create an experience. Aesthetics also work to create the experience, and as Schell describes it, he says, it's how your game looks, sounds, smells, tastes, and feels. Finally, it comes together with the technology, which is the medium that the game is played through. These four basic elements come together to form the elemental tetrad, which fully encompass how video games are made and how they should be made. They are quintessential to the design process, and without them, the game will be bland with no value to the player. We'll come back to these four main elements later on and how Cyberpunk deals with these elements. Now, let's talk Cyberpunk. You might be wondering, isn't it still too early to talk about Cyberpunk? And you'd be right. Sort of. Before getting into the nitty-gritty of what makes Cyberpunk good and what bogs it down, there's a few concepts we need to discuss. The first one is the theme. The theme in a video game resembles what your game is about. It's the idea that ties the game together, and the basic elements need to support it. Themes enhance the experience for every player as it is supposed to resonate with them. It has to incorporate an idea or fantasy that the players have had at one point or another. In the case of Cyberpunk, this fantastical theme would be cybernetic human beings. When people think about technology, they tend to fantasize about cybernetic enhancements and how it could become a reality in the near future. The basis of themes could also be different though, like truth-based themes. These are ranging from war changes the world to objectivism, which means that one person should follow their self-interest. Cyberpunk's truth-based themes revolve around transhumanism mostly, meaning the advocacy of body-modifying enhancements for wide availability. Making sure the theme is something the player base can get excited about is integral to making a well-designed game. Cyberpunk nails these themes into the player, having the design of the aesthetics and story revolve around this main idea. Now, we've been beating around the bush for long enough, so let's talk about the terribleness of Cyberpunk's design. The designers of Cyberpunk 2077 had 8 years to develop a game that would draw the attention of millions of players around the world after cultivating a gigantic hype train. After waiting with our money ready, Cyberpunk was released in December of 2020. The game was mediocre upon release. This was because of a number of reasons. The first and most obvious one is the amount of bugs still in the game. They failed a very important job as game designers, which is to improve the game through iteration. Even though it took them years of development, they still had not tested the game enough considering all of its different mechanics. Schell enforces the idea that looping is incredibly important for game designers. Making sure to test your game over and over again upon adding new content is critical. According to Schell, developers plan to spend 80% of the time getting the game working and only 20% of the time making it great. This is where the designers of Cyberpunk 2077 failed to make the leap. CD Projekt Red had an interesting concept and design for a well-made narrative game. They had new ideas and themes that hadn't been done before, hyped up graphics, and even Keanu Reeves as a star character. However, they failed to realize that testing and iteration is very important for the final product. Not only was this a key failure, but they also failed to heavily playtest the game with potential players. Playtesting is a necessary aspect to game design as it provides a wake-up call to the flaws in your design. Shell doesn't even like playtesting, as it can be humiliating, but stresses how necessary it is to make a good game. I even had a bug at one point while playing the game where I was inside of a dialogue with a character and had just selected a dialogue option. After selecting the option and hearing the character say their line, the dialogue ceases to exist, with me sitting there at the table waiting for something to happen.
Must be prepping him for a transfer.
How would you know?
Chinese Corpo playbook's an open one to me. This looks like the old vanishing pigeon.
I ended up waiting about 5 minutes before having to close my game and restart from the last checkpoint. The bugs make the flow of the game quite terrible. The flow of this game is exactly what it sounds like. It should be able to flow from each section to the next and immerse you in the world. With the bugs, they immediately take you out of your immersion and put you right back into reality where you realize you were just playing a video game. Looking past these negatives, the rest of the game design is quite good and does a successful job of making an unforgettable experience. Alright, now we listened to the Cyberpunk music enough, I think. Let's go back to the old music. I think it's a bit better. To understand how a video game attracts the player and makes them have an enjoyable time during the experience is to comprehend the intricacies of mechanics. We briefly talked about mechanics earlier, but it's time to get down to business. The game mechanics are the core part of what makes a game. Think of game mechanics as a skeleton. They resemble the shape of the game and provide the framework for what makes the game function. You could also think of them as nuts and bolts in a machine. Mechanics provide rules to the player, letting them know what they can and can't do within the realm of the game. For example, if there isn't a mechanic within the game to have your character drink something, then you can't drink anything in-game. I make it sound simple with that example, but it can be way more complicated than that. So let's make it more complicated, shall we? There are different realms and specifics when it comes to defining what mechanics are involved when designing a video game. I'll be calling these the rules of mechanics. The first rule is space. The definition of space is a continuous area or expanse which is free, available, or unoccupied. In terms of video games, space defines the various places that can exist in the game and how those places are related to one another. Looking at older games, there's the concept of worlds, like in Mario and Sonic, where the level you play within is defined by a certain amount of space. Games nowadays take this to a much larger scale, like Cyberpunk. The designers of Cyberpunk gave it the open world approach, which means a world or space where the player can explore and approach objectives freely rather than the other games that are more structured and linear, like BioShock. If BioShock and Cyberpunk swapped between these different types of spaces, they would play very differently. Cyberpunk 2077 handles the use of space in a way that most games that are open world do, which confine you to a certain amount of space, in this case, a city called Night City. The city has set boundaries that can be seen when you look at the map screen, and if you try to go past, you can't go anywhere. It allows you to play within the world they have given you that is still quite expansive and large, sprawling with many different quests to complete. Time is another rule of mechanics that Cyberpunk plays around with as well. In Cyberpunk, they use a system of continuous time where the time of day and night resemble how real life works, except minutes pass faster within the game. It adds to the flow of the game and makes the experience more realistic for the player. The designers also allow players to control time. Sadly, we can't control time in real life, but the function of controlling time in game is a benefit to the player for playability. It allows you to wait a specific amount of time if you want it to be nighttime, or fast travel to help you get around the map quicker. Many games follow this construct, and it's simple but effective. The third rule is objects. These are the tools that are placed into your game that the player can interact with. A list of objects inside a video game could be characters, props, tokens, scoreboards, or basically anything that can be seen or manipulated in your game. All of these objects have certain attributes that describe the state of how the player can interact with them within the constraints of the rules. These are similar to the fourth rule, which are the actions. They resemble the verbs of the game mechanics, where they define the actions the player can take. Actions can range from basic actions like running and jumping to strategic actions like using a certain gun that works better against a certain enemy. Cyberpunk has plenty of actions that the player can use, like shooting a gun, using a melee weapon, using hacking to disable enemies, etc. The vast range of actions provided in Cyberpunk create the vision of emergent gameplay, which Shell defines as gameplay that results from the sheer amount of actions in the game that the player can utilize to create new strategies emerging naturally while playing. The final rules of mechanics are coincidentally the rules. I probably shouldn't have called these the rules of mechanics initially, but who cares. The rules are the most fundamental mechanic. As Shell makes clear, they are what the designer creates in order to define the space, the timing, the objects, the actions, the consequences of the actions, the constraints on the actions, and the goals. Let's break the rules down a bit. There are multiple systems of rules that take part in making Cyberpunk. The first are the operational rules that basically make up what the players do in the game. Foundational rules are the mathematical representation of the game state and how and when it changes. This would be things like boards, dice, chips, and in the case of Cyberpunk, the health meter. The final rule that is used in Cyberpunk are written rules. These are rules such as designing tutorials for the player to experience to help them learn how to play the game, which Cyberpunk has during its 3-hour tutorial/intro. Now, with the intricacies of mechanics laid out, there's one important aspect that is created after collaborating with one another. That is the concept of goals. Games are all about achieving goals. In Cyberpunk, there isn't just one goal, and there are way too many to list out for this video. Each quest that is completed acts as its own goal for the player. In fact, the quests are the goals. They provide the player with something to accomplish in the game that allows for the player to feel a sense of progress. Shell describes what makes good game goals as concrete, achievable, and rewarding. They have to be easy to understand and achievable that feel rewarding. The quests in Cyberpunk do this quite well by providing you with plenty of quests to complete that give you experience and money to help upgrade your character, making you feel the sense of progression. The quests even have difficulties listed on them, so if you don't think you can complete a hard difficulty quest now, you could always come back later. Finally, the designers of Cyberpunk manage the mechanics very well and maintain a nice balance. In order for a game to be fun, it has to be in balance. In the mind of a chef, you have to know how to balance the ingredients to make a delicious dish. The same applies for creating video games. Cyberpunk is an asymmetrical game, which means that the game gives you increasingly powerful power-ups that help you in combat. These are incredibly different as there are a numerous amount of skill trees that you can put points into. You can get more health, more damage when using only specific weapons like katanas or pistols, get more stamina, make your character receive less damage, etc. This tends to make you more powerful than the enemies, which Cyberpunk balances by creating harder enemies that have more armor, which makes them harder to kill, and the leveling system, which shows you which characters are higher level than you and might be more difficult to kill. Along with the skills that make you more powerful, there is also a clothing system that allows you to equip different sets of clothing that give you more armor that decrease how much damage you can take. The other obvious thing that you can do is equip better guns as you play the game that will do more damage. Another balancing act that the designers made sure to look at was the flow channel. The flow channel is basically a graph between challenges on the y-axis and skills on the x-axis. You want to maintain a squiggly pace between anxiety and boredom while playing the game to create a pleasurable experience for the player. The best way Cyberpunk does this is by allowing the player to choose a difficulty at the beginning of the game. They have 4 difficulties to choose from, which are easy, normal, hard, and very hard. Easy is for experiencing the story, normal is for having a good time overall, hard is if you want a bit of a challenge, and very hard is if you hate yourself. Another balancing strategy is the concept of meaningful choices. Shell asks multiple questions like where should I go, how should I spend my resources, how should I dress my character, what strategy should I use in this situation, should I focus on offense or defense, etc. Cyberpunk offers all of these choices and more for the player that allows them to have a feeling of freedom and fulfillment that will help alter their experience of the game. Now, I know this is a lot, but I promise there's only one more thing we need to talk about when it comes to mechanics, and it shouldn't take long. That thing would be puzzles. Shell believes that puzzles can be fun, but once you figure out the best strategy, you'll be able to solve them every time. The fun is figuring out how the puzzle works and how to solve it. However, he brings up an interesting point about puzzles. He categorizes them as anything that makes you stop and think, and that they are mental challenges. Cyberpunk in this instance has a multitude of puzzles. The first of the puzzles that are there are hacking puzzles, where you plug into a computer and pick certain numbers/letters in a chain of different numbers/letters. Completing these puzzles gives you either normal, rare, or legendary construction components that can be used to craft different items. The biggest puzzles of the game, however, are the strategy of what makes a first-person shooter. This would be the order you should shoot the enemies, so that way you take the least damage. In accordance with Shell's definition, this would be considered a puzzle. This puzzle is fun and is often, but complex. Each situation where you encounter enemies is different from the next and might require something different that you didn't use last time to take the least amount of damage. Okay, personally, I've had enough about talking mechanics and how they relate with Cyberpunk, so let's take a little water break and maybe pause. Alright, hopefully everyone watching is ready and refreshed. We're going to talk about the next element, which is the story. Shell states that historically, stories have been single-threaded experiences that can be enjoyed by an individual. However, Cyberpunk flips this theme on its head, implementing interactive storytelling, where your choices impact the plot you receive. The difference in the story and experience depends on the player's ability to take action. The way Cyberpunk tells the story is through the method called the string of pearls. This means that the story is presented in the form of a text, a slideshow, or an animated sequence, and then the player is given a period of free movement and control of the pearl with a fixed goal in mind. Then, when the goal is achieved, the player travels down the string via another sequence to the next pearl. In other words, cutscene, game level, cutscene, game level. You can follow the path of pearls differently in Cyberpunk via the interactive story. I haven't fully finished the game yet, but there are different endings that can be achieved by following the story and making different decisions. The story comes to a single point for every player where a decision is made that changes your path in the story, which creates different endings. The story follows the string of pearls loosely, where it eventually branches off to create different endings. Shell describes something called the story stack, which can be seen here. In simple terms, it means that the higher up on the stack, the more flexible it can be, meaning that it can be changed later on in the design process. Story is last on the stack, as the story should make sense in the world that has been created, and all the other pieces of the stack should make sense in the story. He says how design shouldn't start with a story, as it could lead to the diminishment of other elements of the game. The story elements, if needed, can be changed often, easily with just a few words, where the changing of gameplay elements could take weeks of balancing. Stories also need to have the characters overcome obstacles and have interesting conflicts to arise. This makes for a more interesting story that makes a character engage in problem solving. Obstacles can allow the story to expand as well and have more development. Cyberpunk's story combines these aspects and makes a very well-made story. You play as V, who is a mercenary outlaw who, after completing a major heist, acquires a piece of technology dubbed the Chip of Immortality that has the mind of Johnny Silverhand on it, a famous terrorist of Night City. V finds out that the chip is killing him, and if he doesn't get it out soon, the mind of Johnny Silverhand will take over. The interesting plot allows for a goal to get to at the end of the story, which is to remove the chip. Along the way of the story, there are plenty of interesting characters that are introduced that spice up the story to provide more conflict. The surrounding world also helps with immersing you in the plot and showing how the cybernetic world can be incredibly cutthroat. These two central themes of characters and world make the building of the story so compelling. Night City is a drab and realistic picture of what the distant future could look like, with plenty of criminals, corrupt business people, and the like. The design of the city provides the player with a beautiful landscape of future technology, with hologram billboards and sprawling skyscrapers. Night City has levels of scale, where the player moves to more developed areas as you proceed through the quests, boundaries, which we talked about earlier, and plenty of open space that allows you to interact with it in whatever way you please. The world is compelling, with plenty of characters that help drive the story. The characters are involved in plenty of conflicts that allow for the story to move fluidly. The characters are incredibly rich, each with their own personal problems and motives that enhance the story you create. Characters like Yorinobu Arasaka or Judy Alvarez each have their own traits, biographies, and motives that V interacts with in the game. Yorinobu Arasaka provides the conflict of being a villain and somebody who wants the chip V has obtained. He wants to be strong after killing his father and becoming the head of Arasaka, a worldwide megacorporation dealing in corporate security, banking, and manufacturing. Judy Alvarez works for another important character named Evelyn as a techie and braindance editor. She's a friend of V's who is incredibly realistic and helps V look through virtues, which are the memories of others. There are plenty of other characters that are also rich in detail, like Evelyn, Johnny Silverhand, Pan Am, and Jackie. But just like mechanics, the story is the story. However, the story in Cyberpunk 2077 is incredibly compelling and rich-filled with characters and an intriguing playground to make an interactive experience that has a great storytelling direction. But all things must come to an end, and we should move on to the aesthetics and technology. I decided to bundle aesthetics and technology together as they can be similar, and when talking about them in accordance to Cyberpunk, there isn't a lot to talk about. Aesthetics are the principles that are concerned with nature and beauty. It's basically how the game feels and looks. Cyberpunk 2077's aesthetics are all about technology. Night City doesn't look like your usual city, as it has very different looking buildings, holographic advertisements, and cybernetic people walking around. The thing that these create, though, is atmosphere, which is integral to making a game's aesthetics. The atmosphere is the feeling of the game. It's what gives you the vibe that you are in the future, experiencing what it may be like to have cybernetic enhancements. Some of the settings can be quite beautiful in the game, and there were points where I just had to stop and look around to appreciate what the designers had done with the world building. There's also new sounds that are developed to hear, like how cybernetic guns sound. Another thing that is important to the aesthetics is the interface of the game. The menu resembles a futuristic computer menu, the subtitles show a certain way to make it seem like they're coming from a computer. The decisions that the designers make are intentional here. They want the aesthetics to pop for the viewer, to draw their attention and immerse them in the game environment. Now, let's talk about technology. In the case of Cyberpunk, there isn't a whole lot to touch on here. The game was released for all systems, like the Xbox Next Gen and current gen consoles, PlayStation Next Gen and current consoles, and PC. The interesting thing about this is the difference in play between PC and Xbox/PlayStation. PC's port had very few issues where performance was quite good and there weren't many graphical issues. However, the story for the Xbox and PlayStation was a completely different story. The ports were absolutely horrendous, where the graphics looked like Play-Doh and the game would crash multiple times with the systems failing to run it. It even came to the point where Sony removed Cyberpunk 2077 off of the PlayStation Store, forcing players to buy it in a retail store if they wanted the game. The console launch was quite the mess. They didn't adapt the game to be playable on these consoles, which hurt the profit they made off the game in general. There's a few remarks I would like to make before the video sadly comes to an end. Although there are many issues with Cyberpunk, it's still a good game. It has a well-designed and compelling story, gameplay that adheres to the standards of what makes a game fun, and beautiful scenery/setting. It also follows the Elemental Tetrad, which Shell stresses how integral it is to creating a good game. It does suffer from a plague of bugs that deters players, but the bugs weren't intended to be a part of the game. The idea and concept behind the game from the designers was made to show how fascinating a world with cybernetics could be, and I believe they did a pretty damn good job of all things considered. Now, is it the best game I've ever played? Absolutely not. There are plenty of better games out there that do everything Cyberpunk did better. But if you're looking for an overall good experience of a game that provides you with a fantasy you have thought about since you were younger, it gets the job done. Thanks for watching, and I hope this video was somewhat informational.